Welcome to Fandomology, where I study fandoms, tell you what is awesome and what to avoid. I'm your host Kyle, and today we'll be taking a look at American Vampire. The series follows Pearl Jones, an aspiring actress in 1925 Hollywood. Beginning of the story, Pearl meets with a group of producers who happen to be vampires. They attack her and leave her for dead. Is this a metaphor for how Hollywood producers treat actresses? Maybe. Here we are introduced to Skinner Sweet, the main villain of the series. He breaks down to Pearl how they're evolved vampires and all the previous unevolved vampires will be hunting them down. In the first 5 issues, we are treated to backup stories which give us the origin of Skinner Sweet in 1880 Colorado. This is a pretty big deal because the backup stories were written by Stephen King. I think having Stephen King do these backups was a big deal because it brought a lot of attention to the book that it normally wouldn't have. Each major storyline jumps in the next decade, so we start in 1925, the next story takes place in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, etc. There are 2 miniseries that are included with the books. The first is Survival of the Fittest, which gives us World War II era Nazi vampires. A crazy story. It's a good war story, and it just adds the vampires and it makes it all the better. It introduces the VMS, the Vassals of the Morning Star, a vampire hunting agency that becomes important later on in the series. The second miniseries is Lord of the Vampires. This series takes us back to the times of Transylvania and introduces us to the American Vampire version of Dracula. Unfortunately, American Vampire has been on hiatus for the last few years. The last book at this time is Volume 8, and it has us in 1965, at the height of the space race. That's right, vampires in space. This last book also introduces the Grey Traitor. We don't really get to see this character, but it's described as the most mysterious and evil thing in the world. I'd love to see this series keep going and go further into each decade. What were vampires doing in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and so forth. Overall, the story is excellent. The writing is great. The art is superb. I think jumping through the decades keeps things fresh, keeps things interesting. I'd love to see him come back to the series and continue on through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I would love to see what he would do going forward. The characters are great throughout. Pearl has a beautifully tragic story. Skinner Sweet is about as unlawful evil as it gets. You get introduced to characters, but you don't want to get too attached to them because you don't know how long they'll survive. My personal favorite character is Cash McCogan, a sheriff in 1930s Las Vegas who's tasked with trying to figure out why victims are dying in their sleep. The art by Raphael Albuquerque is perfect for this series. It's dark and shadowed when it needs to be, and it's bright and vibrant and colorful when it needs to be. Even when they change out artists at certain times, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. It stays really high up there in quality. I can't really think of anything negative to say about this series. Like I said, the writing's great, the art's great. I think the only thing that I come up with was the whole Vassals of the Morning Star. Using that trope of like a secret agency really kind of takes away from the horror element. And becomes more of an action series from that point. However, at times they do go back to the horror element, and when they do, it is superb. I'd love to see this as a TV series, especially with the budget that TV shows get these days. It could be on par with shows like Vampire Diaries and True Blood, with multiple seasons getting across all the stories. All that being said, I can't wait till Snyder comes back and can finish this series. It is the type of story that keeps you wanting more and more and more. Right after you finish one book, you want to go out and get the next book, and then the next book. And so right now, I'm done with 8, and I'm just waiting and waiting for that 9th book to come out. Thank you for joining me here today as I talked about American Vampire by Scott Snyder and Raphael Albuquerque. I highly recommend this book series. You can find it on Comixology or your local comic book shop. I'm Kyle, and this has been Fandomology.